Hey, let's talk about serialization and JSON, JSON. So, what is serialization? It's a long word, it's kind of hard to say sometimes. Serialization, it means to put things into a line, put them into a sequence. And in our case, serializing data means we are taking objects from our code, say in C#, and we're going to have to put them in a format that can be transmitted to another computer or whatever, transmitted either through a file or through the network. So this is a kind of streamable format, and there are many different ways we can do that. We can put objects into a binary format, a sequence of just ones and zeros describing the data. We could put it in a human readable format, and those are really useful. And you've probably seen a lot of effectively serialized formats like configuration files for Windows or for games or whatever. These are files that describe data, and they have to be loaded into a game in order to get that data into the game. So there are other ways that this is used. You may be familiar with HTML. HTML is one of these kinds of human readable data transfer formats, and the kind of superset of HTML is XML. XML is a more generic way of describing data, and is described in a plain text format that you can read and you can edit by hand. Whereas if you were to do it in a binary format, you wouldn't want to mess with the data in that file, type things in there, because then it wouldn't work anymore. So JSON, JSON, is JavaScript object notation, and its main intention was to be able to describe JavaScript objects. But it's been used way wider than that because it's a fairly simple format. It's easy to understand and has only a few important rules. So JSON itself is a subset of YAML, Y-A-M-L, and you've probably never heard of that one. But because there are limitations to what JSON can do, it doesn't fit every use case. It's great for serializing data, but there are things that YAML can do in the way it describes data and the way it can be validated that JSON just can't do. So what JSON is really good for, though, is that it is pretty concise in how it describes data. And that makes it a really good candidate for communicating over a network. You want to save bandwidth. You don't want to send more data, more characters or letters than you need to. And JSON is pretty short and sweet. So it's actually very widely used on the internet between RESTful APIs. If you want to communicate with a server and get a response from them, very often you're going to get a response in JSON. So let me show you an example of what JSON looks like. And we can see how it describes data. Right up at the top, this particular example starts with a curly brace, and you can see more curly braced things going on here. And there's also square brackets around some places. And this particular example is a kind of message, a request that you would send to a website. You would send this kind of formatted message with some information about what you're trying to do, and they will send you a response back. And you can parse that response and understand what happened, if your request was successful, and what kind of information your request was asking for might be responded to you. So the curly braces, they denote a mapping. This is kind of like, you can think of it kind of like a C# dictionary, where you're matching one type of data with another. And in JSON, because it's a text format, you can think of these all as strings. Arguments here, in quotes, is a string, and the colon separates the key from the value. And the value that is being mapped to is this other stuff on the right-hand side. We also have the key URL mapped to this string over here. It's an HTTP URL. We have method mapped to the word post, header mapped to this thing in curly braces. And so these curly braces, since they denote a mapping, this header part and this arguments part are actually mapping some string to another mapping. And so it's hierarchical. You can have different levels of a hierarchy, just like we have in our programs when we are expressing objects. An object with variables could be written out as a mapping. Say I have an object that has a position vector. The position vector might be called position, and so I might have a key position, and then on the other side I might have the X, Y, and Z components in some form. So now in this body mapping here, body is mapped to something with square brackets, and the square bracket denotes a sequence. So this is more like an array, so just a bunch of things in a row. So we have two different objects in a row. This first object has an ID, has a name, has a description, and you can see the values on the right hand side. So this is what JSON looks like, and those are the basic rules of how it's put together. Fairly simple and pretty quick to explain. Now, the communicating with websites part is kind of fun, so I want to show you some examples. Here's a website that lets you just run this Linux command, Unix command, curl. So you can use curl to kind of download web pages or send requests. So let me try one of those. So here's a particular website, pokeapi.co, and it provides an API that gives you information about Pokemon. So I've put in Bulbasaur as part of this URL, and this is how this particular RESTful API communicates what I'm looking for. I'm sending a GET request, so it's requesting information from the website. I can send this out and see what the response looks like. So it gave me a response that is completely in JSON over here, and I can scroll all the way through it. It's a lot of data they sent back to me. There's a lot of information about Bulbasaur. So there are abilities, there are moves, there are what games it's in, all that sort of thing, how it learns these different moves and at what time. Pretty cool. Here's another one, just a random website that you can send messages to. This is a website where you can get information about a zip code. So here's a zip code. I wonder where that is. Let's find out. And it's telling me, all right, the postal code that I sent was 98121. It's in the United States. Great. I know of these things. And this place is Seattle, Washington. They even give me a longitude and latitude so I can locate it using those coordinates. So there are tons and tons of websites that communicate with their servers using RESTful APIs, using this kind of stuff, sending a request to the website and getting a response, very commonly in JSON. So it's a really important data format to be familiar with. Well, I'll see you next time when we talk about how we will serialize our own objects into a JSON form. See you then.